It's one of those moments where you stop and think, wait, are we really here already? Because while most people were distracted by the usual noise, something far more serious was unfolding in the background. The former president of the United States is openly floating threats that used to be unthinkable, and countries that spent decades relying on rules and alliances are suddenly realizing those rules might not protect them anymore. And Canada? Canada didn't wait to find out the hard way. Let's start with something most people overlooked. Before flying to China, before sitting down with European leaders, before engaging in any high-stakes global diplomacy, Mark Carney made a very deliberate stop in British Columbia. Not Ottawa, not Washington, British Columbia. And that choice tells you almost everything you need to know about how seriously Canada is taking what's happening right now. Because this wasn't a feel-good visit. It wasn't a photo op. It was a strategic move made at a moment when sovereignty, especially along Canada's coasts and in the Arctic, has stopped being an abstract concept and started feeling very real.
It's an important time for our country. It's a decisive moment for Canada. And I'm very focused on not just building, but how we build and how we build together. So today is really about a dialogue. It's a dialogue of what's been happening in the region, the projects that have been led by the various First Nations here, the various opportunities that do exist, the imperative of conservation, how we have been doing on conservation. This immense, precious natural heritage, which is a huge responsibility for all of us, but is core to the identity of the First Nations here. So how we work together to preserve that, to enhance it. We're looking for opportunities for development. So today's not a day for big announcements. It is a day, as I say, for dialogue, for listening and working. There will be a time for coming back with progress, particularly with respect to...
Donald Trump has been pushing boundaries again, publicly, repeatedly, from talking about Greenland in ways that go far beyond diplomacy, to aggressive rhetoric toward Mexico, to previous pressure campaigns in places like Venezuela. The pattern is hard to ignore. This isn't just tough talk. It's a worldview, one where power matters more than rules, and where alliances are treated as optional. And here's where things get interesting. When Trump talks about Greenland, a lot of people hear bluster. Canada hears a warning, because Greenland isn't just a Danish issue. It sits in the Arctic. And the Arctic is one of the fastest changing strategic regions on the planet. Melting ice is opening shipping lanes, resource access is expanding, military interest is rising, and suddenly, what used to be frozen and distant is becoming contested. That's why Carney went west first. He met with coastal First Nations leaders in British Columbia because that's where Canada's sovereignty is lived every day, not debated in think tanks. These communities are on the front lines of conservation, resource protection, and territorial stewardship. And at a moment when external pressure is growing, internal unity becomes non-negotiable. Carney said it plainly. This was a decisive moment for Canada, not just about what gets built, but how it gets built, and who gets to decide. He framed the visit as a dialogue, a chance to listen, to understand what's already happening on the ground, to talk about conservation, development, and the responsibility that comes with protecting an immense natural heritage. Some people brushed that off as cautious language. In my view, that was the point. Because when the global environment is getting more dangerous, the smartest moves often don't look dramatic. They look deliberate. They look boring. They look like preparation. This stop in British Columbia wasn't symbolic. It was foundational. Here's why that matters. Trump's approach relies on division, on isolating targets, on forcing countries to respond individually rather than collectively. If Canada ever faces economic pressure, political coercion, or territorial intimidation, the response won't come from a single leader or a single speech. It will come from whether the country is aligned from coast to coast, including Indigenous leadership whose role in sovereignty is increasingly recognized internationally. That's what Carney was locking in. Now zoom out for a second. This isn't just about Canada. Trump is openly challenging the idea that international law restrains powerful countries. When a U.S. president threatens annexation, military action, or coercion against allies, not adversaries, It sends a signal far beyond those specific cases. It tells the world that the old assumptions no longer apply. And once that door opens, it doesn't close easily. Many commentators have pointed out that global instability rarely starts with tanks crossing borders. It starts with normalizing the idea that borders are flexible if you're strong enough, that treaties are suggestions, that alliances are transactional. That's the real danger here. Online reactions to Trump's Greenland comments weren't just outrage or memes. In diplomatic circles, they triggered quiet reassessments. In Europe, officials began asking uncomfortable questions. If this can happen to Denmark, a NATO member, who's actually safe? One analyst laid out 3 scenarios. In the worst one, Europe hesitates, promises support, talks tough, then does nothing. And Greenland is taken. If that happens, the entire post-war order collapses overnight. Because at that point, we're no longer in a rules-based system. We're in an age where force decides everything. And here's the part most people misunderstand. Canada doesn't get to sit that out. If Greenland falls, Canada's Arctic becomes the next pressure point. Shipping routes, airspace, northern waters. This isn't paranoia, it's geography. And Canadian leaders know it. That's why Canada moved early. Carney didn't wait for a direct threat. He publicly backed Denmark and Greenland. He signaled that intimidation would not be treated as normal. He reinforced alliances before they were tested instead of after they cracked. Some critics called that provocative. I see it differently. Once threats are tolerated, they become permission. By drawing a line early, Canada lowered the risk of ever having to defend it later at a much higher cost. And Europe noticed. French leaders warned openly that threats against Canada and Greenland would undermine the entire global system. NATO planners began quietly reassessing risk scenarios. The conversation shifted from "this is unlikely" to "we need to be prepared." That shift doesn't happen because of grandstanding. It happens because of trust. Carney didn't try to dominate the moment. He coordinated. He listened. He aligned interests. And in doing so, Canada suddenly carried more weight than its size would suggest. That's a subtle but important change. For decades, Canada has been seen as a reliable partner, but rarely a central player. Right now, that perception is shifting. Not because Canada is threatening anyone, but because it's helping hold things together while others are escalating. While Trump provokes and destabilizes, Carney has been doing the opposite, slowing things down, absorbing pressure, keeping allies talking instead of panicking. Some people mistake that for weakness. It isn't. Control doesn't always look loud. Leadership in moments like this isn't about dominating headlines. It's about preventing crises that never make the news. And from the reactions I've seen, that's exactly why other leaders are listening to Carney right now. In a world tilting toward uncertainty, steady hands stand out. And none of this is happening in isolation. Carney's stop in British Columbia, his coordination with Europe, his engagement with China, these aren't disconnected trips. They're layers of protection being built in real time. First, unity at home, because a divided country is easy to pressure. Then, alliances abroad, because intimidation only works when countries stand alone. Now, economic diversification, because dependence is leverage, and leverage can be weaponized. Put together, it paints a clear picture. Canada isn't reacting anymore, it's positioning. Trump's strategy thrives on fracture, on forcing choices, on isolating targets and applying bilateral pressure. Carney's strategy does the opposite. It strengthens systems, removes leverage, turns chaos into coordination. You don't have to agree with every decision to see the pattern. This is containment, not confrontation. History rarely announces its turning points. Sometimes they show up quietly, in meetings that don't trend, in dialogue that doesn't go viral, in coordination that looks boring until you realize what it prevented. At a moment when the global order is under real strain, Canada has chosen to stabilize rather than escalate. And in doing so, Mark Carney has placed himself, calmly and deliberately, at the center of an effort to keep that order from unraveling. That might not dominate every headline, but it could be the reason the system survives. If you found this perspective useful and want more clear-eyed analysis as the world gets more unpredictable, consider subscribing. I appreciate you.